Welcome back to Bible in Context. Hey, Nate.
Good to be back, Caleb.
Yeah, it is. And sorry, I probably sound a little bit nasally. I've been fighting a cold all week, but finally on the mend. I just probably sound a little funny.
Didn't even notice.
Well, we are diving back into creation ex materia and creation ex nihilo. We're continuing this conversation. After the past couple of weeks, we've gone over ancient Near Eastern creation stories and how people in that time and place thought about creation. And then we talked about the biblical background to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo and kind of deconstructed that a little bit last week with a lot of the verses that seem to teach creation ex nihilo. We showed how a proper understanding of the culture, the meaning of being or ontos in that culture and the translation point to the fact that maybe the biblical authors assumed that the world was created from waters rather than nothing. And so we still have to explore a little bit, what does that actually mean, scientifically, philosophically, doctrinally, and we don't have all the answers on that, but we're going to start that conversation. But first, we want to talk about, in this episode, Proverbs 8 a little bit, because we mentioned that last time and we just completely forgot it. And then we want to talk about where did this doctrine come from, if it didn't come from the Bible, ex nihilo, that is. And then we'll talk a little bit about, is the Bible teaching creation ex materia, creation from waters, or is it simply assuming that for another purpose? What do we think about this scientifically? So, with that, I think we need a reminder that with such a contentious topic, not to be hostile. Remember, we're brothers and sisters.
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to understand that, this is just a discussion we're having. This is Caleb and I were talking last week about just feeling how this whole topic is a little bit over our heads, in a sense.
We actually spent the whole time talking about that, and we didn't get to record at all.
Yeah.
Because we were just talking.
Last week we recorded about 4 minutes, and we just ditched it all because we ran out of time. But yeah, this is a topic and a doctrine that I think we kind of just tack up on the wall. There's certain doctrines we're going to nail on the wall, and we're not going to. They're going to stay there. They're not going to move. This is one of those topics, those ideas that it's fun to talk about. Does have some interesting and important implications depending on which way you go. It's definitely opened my eyes to see that there is actually a legitimate debate that should be had, and so just want to be part of that conversation and see where it goes. And so with that, Caleb, why don't you jump us back into Proverbs 8?
Yeah, and some of these doctrines, some of these implications, I just want to say real quick that they can be kind of big, and so that's why we feel like this has to be primary. But as we dive into these, I think that you can hold ex nihilo or ex materia and still see Christ as our redeeming King. All of those, nail on the wall doctrines, they're still nailed on the wall. So
yeah, your salvation does not depend on whether or not you believe in ex materia or ex nihilo,
right? Nor the fact that you and others are bound to the same body, the body of Christ. Yeah. We're still brothers and sisters, even if we disagree on this, and even if you think it's super important, we need to take a step back and say, yes, it's important, but I can still serve the mission of Christ alongside these people I disagree with. So it's one of those issues. So let's jump into Proverbs 8 because, again, we missed that one last week, and that one's actually pretty important because that is the one place in the Bible that it seems like creation ex nihilo is being talked about. And I mean, this is Proverbs. This is Old Testament. This is pretty early stuff. So in Proverbs 8, I'm going to read verses 22 down through I'll say 7 for now. So it says, Yahweh created me, and that's wisdom talking, wisdom personified talking. Yahweh created me, the first of his ways, before his acts of old. From eternity I was set up from the first, from the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs of abounding water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth. When he had not yet made the earth and fields, or the first dust of the world. When he established the heavens, there I was. When he drew a circle upon the face of the deep. When he made skies from above. When he founded fountains of the deep. When he assigned his limits to the sea. that waters should not transgress his command when he marked the foundations of the earth. And it continues going. It says, I was beside him, a master workman. And so this is wisdom talking. I went on through verse 30 there, but this is wisdom talking about her being created before the earth was created. And in verse 24, she says, when there were no depths, no tehom is the word, the pre-creation waters. Before those, I was brought forth. And when there were no springs abounding water, I was made. And so it sounds like right here, wisdom is saying there was a time before the waters. There's a few issues to talk about with this verse. The first one is a translation issue, and then we also have the idea of genre being important, and then also the way that this text was used or not used later in biblical interpretation. The first thing, the translation. When it says, when there were no depths, literally, this is in Hebrew, ba'ain. This is in no depths where I created, in no springs of water. And so there is no actual time reference there. The rest of the verses in 25 and 26, whenever you see before the mountains or when he had done this or that, those are actually words related to time. That's actually before or when there was not something. But this first one is just, in no depths I was created. Well, because the rest of these words are time-oriented, it makes sense to say, when she says, in no depths, it makes sense to say, okay, she means before there were depths to be made in. And that's very much a possibility. I think that's the thrust of the passage. However, it could be that what she's saying is, unlike everything else, I was not made and formed from waters. I am the only thing that was formed differently. I was formed with a different material substance, and therefore I am utterly different and above everything else. And that makes sense because this is Yahweh's wisdom. So this is likened to Yahweh himself. It makes sense for us to say, like, God was not made from the same chaos that the rest of the world was made out of. So this could be just kind of an ontological qualifier from wisdom, saying, like, unlike everything else, I am not from the ruin, the chaos, the waters. This wisdom comes from Yahweh himself, and so is therefore materially different. That could be what this is doing here, and has no bearing on whether or not there were waters from the beginning. And again, that's just a maybe, so I'm not going to hang my hat on that. The real thing with this passage is the genre, the subject of the passage, and how it's used later. So this is all couched in poetry. And okay, I'm not going to play the easy card and say, okay, it's poetry, we don't have to take it seriously. I feel like that's the way poetry is used sometimes in biblical interpretation. But what's actually going on here is we are talking about wisdom personified and Yahweh's wisdom being created. So first of all, wisdom is not a person, so immediately we have something metaphorical going on here. We also have wisdom being created, Yahweh's wisdom. So if you take this passage literally, what do we have? We have a time before creation when Yahweh was not wise. I mean, should we read this all that literally? Or should we understand this as all saying that wisdom is preeminent over everything? Yahweh's wisdom is preeminent, and it is the source of all creation. I think that's what's ultimately going on here. And I think it's reasonable to say, okay, so this is not later interpreted as creation ex nihilo because they're seeing these things. In later passages in the New Testament, we still have statements about the world being created from waters, and then whenever there are other statements about creation, we have Colossians, like we talked about, which is referring to the rulers and the earthly and spiritual powers being created. We have John 1, where he qualifies his statement that Jesus made all things with of the things that were made. And so there's something that wasn't made. Go back and listen to that if you haven't. Really, these episodes are a series, so they really go together. So if you haven't listened to that, let me just say pause and go back. But in Proverbs 8, we don't have a teaching of creation ex nihilo. We just have kind of a poetic exaggeration of wisdom's preeminence. And possibly it's not even saying that there weren't any waters. It's just saying that wisdom ontologically is materially different than everything else. So I talked about that for quite a while.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. I think that explains this passage, because I remember having a conversation with you when I was studying this, asking, does this mess up ex nihilo?
Yeah. Well, and actually in Hubler's dissertation, this is one where I think he kind of writes this off as like, okay, this is Proverbs, it's poetry, it's talking about wisdom, but doesn't really explain it. So when you said that at first, I kind of had thought through this before and dismissed it and forgot about it. And so you said that, I was like, wait, what? Maybe this all falls apart. So,
right.
But again, on another re-examination, I think this actually does not take us back to creation ex nihilo, ultimately.
Yeah, and I do think he does make a strong argument that the fact that the genre here is poetry, we've got to kind of take what it says with a grain of salt and understand it's not necessarily meant to be taken as literally as we would if it was a narrative.
Right, and not just poetry, like not historical poetry. I mean, again, if you take this literally, there was a time when Yahweh was dumb.
Right.
And so you've got to step back for a second and say, wait, if wisdom here is being created, something's going on that's not meant to be a blueprint for creation. All right, so I think we've been through all of the biblical texts now between this episode and the last, talking about where creation ex nihilo is assumed but doesn't show up. And so I think the next step we have to ask is, how did we get here?
Yeah, where did ex nihilo come from? If we're not seeing it explicitly being taught in the Bible, where did this idea come from? Yeah,
because, I mean, if we don't answer that, then obviously the answer is going to be, well, it came from the Bible and you just can't interpret it right.
Right.
And so, I mean, where did this come from? This doctrine did not come out of a vacuum, and it didn't. It actually came out of some philosophical considerations of the 2nd century. And so, just like we said, we have to talk about this so that we know where it came from, and it's not just like, oh, well, you just misread the text and it's coming out of the Bible. But if we show where it's coming from, we can show really the assumptions behind the doctrine and how it is extra-biblical. So this is going to be a short exploration of the philosophical backgrounds in the 2nd century that, well, actually before then, that lead up to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. But I want to make this real short because we're here to study the Bible. If you want more of this, go to Hubler's dissertation. But I just want to give a brief overview without putting you to sleep, if we haven't already.
Good luck.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'll just, again, try to make this brief, but start at the beginning. So he talks about at first how philosophy was more or less thought to be born in Miletus after some Miletian thinkers came back from Egypt and brought their thoughts to Miletus. And one of these thinkers, Thales, he's kind of known as the father of philosophy. And these early philosophers, they had the idea that change is the prerogative of being. And, okay, so what do I mean there? Let me take God, for instance. When we think about God, he is so the source of being, often in our thought, that he cannot change. He is immutable. And if he changes, he is somehow less being. And so, therefore, in our theology, he can't. In some Christian philosophical thinking and theological structures.
Yeah, if God is perfect, how can he be anything different? Because if he was anything different, he'd be less than perfect.
Right, and so they think that being itself has to be our idea of perfect in every way, absolutely unchanging. And that is how philosophy, really ever since right after these early philosophers, has been shaped. Well, these early philosophers, they thought, well, no, things that are can change. Because we're here and we change. To put it one way, if you look at a river, you see the water changing and moving, but it's still the same river. However, another philosopher would come along and say, if you look at a river and the water flows through it, it is now an entirely new river. Anything that is cannot change.
Now, would you argue that there are certain things about God that do not change, like certain character aspects and
certain characteristics? Yeah, absolutely. But we do see his emotions changing. He changes his mind from time to time based on the actions of humans. And I think the same thing is true of us, where, yes, over the course of, I don't know how long it takes, a decade or something like that, you are an entirely new set of skin cells. You are not the same material you were at the beginning of your life. But you're still you, and you still have skin. And you still have the same mental processes and personality, things like that. And so these early philosophers, they thought, yes, something that is can change. And later philosophers, starting with Parmenides, said that being must be ungenerated, imperishable, eternal, and unshakable, and endless. And so there's this idea that if something exists, then it has to be absolutely perfect and pure, unchanging. And if something does change, then it is part of the physical world, which is corrupted and less and not good.
So you're talking about, or he was talking about like a deity.
No, he's talking about, this might be going a little
like this
deeper.
table. Would he say that this is unchanging?
Well, no. So this is the kind of what's in the earthly realm.
Okay.
And it has changed form. And so there is out there, this is going more into Plato's thought, and there's some debate back in this day, but to take Plato's thought, he thought everything that is, like this table, there's tables in this room, there's tables out there that are different, but you still recognize them as a table. Well, somewhere out in the spiritual realm, I suppose, there is an ideal form of a tableness, and that is an unchanging, absolutely perfect, ideal table.
Okay, so that's what he's talking about here when he says something that is being, is ungenerated and imperishable, entire, unshakable. Yes. He's talking about something in the spiritual realm that's the ideal.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, there's different ways to think about that among early Greek philosophers. I kind of gave you Plato's idea of it, or Socrates' version. But that's kind of the idea, is they thought that whatever is true being, whether it's one thing or many things, like Plato saw many things. There's tableness, chairness, godness, humanness. Others saw just one perfect being, God, that everything else emanates from. But either way, they thought whatever being emanates from must be absolutely pure and perfect in that way. And this led them to believe that this world, where there was change, it was either an illusion or it's a corrupted version of what should be, and everything in the world is really just a bad form of the ideal. And so kind of to escape this world was what you wanted. You wanted to attain to the realm of the forms, the ideas, the spiritual realm, so to speak, I guess. And as you go on, you have people who start to debate what exactly is matter, what exactly should we think of the quote-unquote forms or the ideas. You have Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, they all go back and forth. And again, Hubler goes into all of this in more detail. Overall, they saw matter as changing, as corrupted and corruptible. Matter was the limit to goodness in the world and the human condition. So it is either to be accepted as like we're just in a bad place, or it is to be escaped. And then based on the corruptibility of matter and the fact that heavenly bodies were seen as greater, resurrection was seen as a negative and ridiculous thing by Greek thinkers. Because if you left the world, why in the world would you want to come back to corruptible, terrible matter? That's how Greeks thought about the world. And so, the biblical hope of resurrection, that's why a lot of Greeks thought Christians were idiots. Because why in the world would your hope be to come back to this body, this corruptible matter? So, they seemed stupid to Greek thinkers. And so, in the 2nd century, they had to combat that thought and make some apologetics for it. I think they went down the wrong path, personally. I think the correct answer is, well, no. Yes, matter started off, even in the biblical imagination, as something ruinous and chaotic. You had the waters, but God shapes it into something actually good by His power. He is the creator and sustainer. I think that's the correct answer. So if He makes matter good and puts us back in it, awesome. But we have, in the 2nd century, a guy named Tatian. He said that God emanates matter in creation, and so He can make matter uncorrupt when He recreates it. And he kind of gives us the first seeds of ex nihilo as he is debating against the Stoics, if I remember correctly. Then as we go down the road, we have another guy named Theophilus of Antioch who is following Tatian, and he adds a little bit more to this to say that from nothing means actually like no material. There's kind of a development of the idea here. It's hard to explain. Again, go check out the dissertation. But Theophilus is arguing against Neoplatonists. And then we have Irenaeus, who you've probably heard of, in the late 2nd century, arguing against Gnostics and other Greek thinkers. So all these guys, as they are doing apologetics against other Greek thinkers and bouncing off of one another, they're kind of developing this doctrine that, well, if for matter to be truly good, God must create all things from nothing so that He can make it from its base good.
So what you're saying is ex nihilo was kind of born out of this reaction to Greek philosophy, and so Greek philosophy taught that all matter was evil, essentially. And so to combat that idea, ex nihilo explained a world in which God created everything from nothing to be good.
Right, not from chaos, but he can create matter from nothing as good. And we really don't get the full doctrine of creation ex nihilo up until actually Augustine. Up until Augustine, matter was still seen as bad, and so the idea of the resurrection was that God's going to, I think, create anew from ex nihilo, or from nothing. But Augustine, he taught that matter was simply the result of creation and was not evil. It was a lack of dependence on God which makes something corrupted and evil. And so humans can sin because they are not from God, but they are from nothing by God. And so our ability to sin comes from our nothingness origin. If we were of God's essence, or we actually came out of God ex deo instead of ex nihilo, then we wouldn't be able to sin. So that was kind of his idea.
So you're saying that Augustine actually... Okay, so he believed in ex nihilo, but he has actually this third category in mind of ex deo.
Well, no, he actually has a true ex nihilo in mind, where God did not bring us out of anything, not even out of himself. It was truly out of nothing.
Right.
And some will say that whenever God created, by his word, he created out of himself. I think that's more of a popular idea of what ex nihilo means. But ex nihilo truly means out of nothing. If we were created from God's own being and essence, then we would be ex deo.
Okay. So I wonder if a lot of people, when they're thinking ex nihilo, they're actually thinking ex deo.
Probably so.
Yeah.
I think so. Which, again, that leads you, and this is why the early thinkers got away from that, is because if you're ex deo, then everything is God.
Right.
We're all kind of this symbiosis, like kumbaya, we're all
Pantheism.
one. And, right. Yeah. Well, even more than that, like everything is God. God is in this table. God is in that window plastic plant.
Yeah.
Everything is God and we are God.
Right.
And not only like deity, but like Yahweh.
Right.
So you can see why the philosophers are like, no, we're not going down that path.
Like New Age philosophy has a little bit of that mindset.
Oh, absolutely.
In it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very popular. I think that's especially a Hinduistic idea, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just thinking like Oprah theology. Where
yeah.
You've got you've got a little bit of deity in each one of you. Which, I mean, even as Christians, we believe the Holy Spirit indwells us, but we don't believe that we are the Spirit.
Right. We believe we're the temples, the house of God.
Yeah, we're the dwelling place, not the actual.
Yeah, not a little piece of Him that's been either fragmented or replicated out through. We're not little Yahweh clones or something.
We're meant to reflect the image, but we are not the actual. Like, we are an image, not the actual deity.
Yeah, I mean, so just to wrap this back around, so ultimately where this doctrine came from was Greek thinkers. They thought matter is terrible. The world is bad, it's corrupt, it's the limit to all the goodness in the world. So why in the world would you want to be resurrected? Why would that be your hope? Well, Christians, our hope is that God is going to resurrect us and make this world His temple. We've talked about this, since the first couple of episodes where we talked about creation as a temple. So again, go back and check that out if you want to. And so the Christian philosophers, instead of saying, well, God takes the ruin and makes it truly good, they agreed with the Greeks that, yes, matter is terrible. It's the limit to all goodness. It's corrupted and corruptible. And so what we actually have to say is God is going to create matter from nothing so that it can actually have goodness. Until we have some later thinkers getting up to Aquinas where he's like, no, even matter from the beginning was good, and it's because we did not depend on God. Since we were from nothing, we had kind of a choice. We decided to depend on ourselves and idols instead of God, and so therefore we were corrupted. And so it's not matter itself. Matter is clay in God's hands, and we ruined it. The biblical idea is, again, it was ruined. It is clay in His hands, but it's placed. It's kind of bad. It's not fit for humans and God, and so He makes it good. And this is how I think the second century philosophers should have tried to argue, but they went a different route. And something that we're going to get into in a few minutes in our kind of discussion about the implications of all this is Augustine kind of left the question open of, well, if we are all truly from nothing, then what is our relationship to God? And it's not until Aquinas that he begins to step in, and this is, about 1,000 years later, that Aquinas steps in and tries to answer that question with some really confusing language I still don't fully grasp, and I don't think it makes sense. Not so much to say that I have not studied it enough. I didn't devote the time to it. I just kind of read through Hubler's summary of it. But I do think that really whenever you begin to look at it from the biblical perspective of creation ex materia, it's like you did all this gymnastics to get us to this apologetic place, but it's unnecessary and it's confusing and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense ultimately. And that's why Aquinas really struggles, I think, to get his ideas across. It's because ultimately they'll say, well, it's difficult to get across because we're trying to explain the unknowable God. And I think maybe there's some truth in that, but I think that the Bible actually portrays to us a very knowable and relational and close God, especially in proximity, because they imagine him being, I don't know, a few thousand feet up in the air, so not in some unreachable infinite plane. That's where we are today, really. So just to give you a brief explanation of Aquinas' thought, so he talked about how if you look through a window in a dark room and you can see the light beam coming in, that is sunlight that comes from the sun, and it kind of is the sunlight itself, but it's not the actual sun. In the same way, our being emanates from God, but yet we're not ex deo, we're not created from the deity, and we are also still ex nihilo, but have some relationship to God, because the reason we have being and essence is because his essence kind of shines through us. And so that's how we can relate and, his word, participate in relationship with God, because we are kind of like sunlight is to the sun. He has a few more examples. It's ultimately the more you read his actual examples, the more confusing it gets. Again, I think it's just philosophical gymnastics that you have to do if you assume creation ex nihilo. I know I'm not doing it justice, but I would love to actually have someone who is well-versed in philosophy come on here at some point. But yeah, maybe I should say one more thing is like this really has to go back to the quality of your essence or being. And again, this is a whole philosophical topic that takes a while to get your head around. Philosophy, I think, especially I think biblical studies for me is pretty easy. Philosophy, I don't like it, especially at least ancient philosophy. Modern philosophy is a little more, I think, easy to understand because often it's more political. But anyway, the big question for Aquinas is God is pure being himself. And so for us to be, we must have some sort of relationship with him. Otherwise, we couldn't be. We couldn't exist. We can't be part of the realm of things that are. And so that's the question he's trying to wrestle with, and saying that we must have some sort of relationship with him for us to even exist, and then, further to come into his presence and so on. And so the way he solves that without making us ex deo is the sunlight analogy. He is the sun, and we kind of have his light shining through us, his being shining through us in a way. So that way we can share in God's being, we can participate in his being, in his, just being here, and also not be close enough to him as to dirty his name or raise ourselves above our station in his mind.
That makes sense. Well, as much as I can possibly understand it.
Yeah, I don't like this topic, but I just wanted to explain it. I feel like we had to, because if we don't, where did this all come from? It must be in the Bible somewhere. If you know where something comes from, it makes it easier to stomach losing this seemingly important doctrine. And I think as our conversation continues, that's where we're going to get into more of the implications of this doctrine.